Good evening. My name is Peter Christian Aigner. I'm the director of the Gotham Center for New York City History here at the Graduate Center of City University of New York, and it is my pleasure to welcome you all to our program tonight. Thank you for joining as well to those who are watching the live stream at home. And special thanks to Karen Sander and the Office of Public Programs here at the Graduate Center for hosting, Tim Bent and Oxford University Press for all their support, and most of all to Salvador Abarca Arriaga for his extraordinary videography work these past few months. Gracias por su ayuda, señora. Tonight, as you know, we'll be discussing this new book from Mike Wallace, Gotham at War. It's the kind of book we have come to expect from its author. Gigantic in length, kaleidoscopic in scope, yet briskly, dynamically written, the narrative anchored in wonderfully rich little biographical portraits that humanize a whirlwind of events that he somehow manages to weave together in a sum that is much larger than its parts. Each little mosaic is punctuated by arresting quotes or eye-stopping statistics which underscore the larger general argument that whatever haters might say, New York City really has been America's most important metropolis for the better part of U.S. history. In the years covered by this latest chapter of the story, it even became the capital of the world. After the global struggle against fascism, which, as Mike tells us on the very first page, started in New York City shortly after Hitler seized power. But tonight will be more than a book discussion. Gotham at War is the final volume in a trilogy which has been a half-century in the making. 50 years of research that produced 3 landmark books, which in turn have established Mike Wallace as the greatest historian of New York City. By rights, we should all be listening to him speak this evening at this crowning moment of his career and the end of what became his life's work. But several years ago, he developed Lewy body dementia, and by now, the condition has left him frequently unable to speak. So instead, we have prepared a different kind of program, one that is half tribute, celebrating the extraordinary career of the man who established the Gotham Center 25 years ago and retired from CUNY at the highest rank a professor can earn, and the other half, a panel discussion on this brilliant and disturbingly relevant book about New York's experience with the rise of fascism and World War II. We'll begin that latter conversation in a few minutes, but to start off the evening, we've created this short documentary on Mike Wallace and the Gotham Project that we hope you'll enjoy.
Extra, extra, read all about it.
New York, America's unofficial capital for the better part of the last 400 years. The unrivaled headquarters for business and finance, arts and letters, cuisine and fashion, and just about anything else you can think of. It's a city that has drawn visionaries and pioneers, refugees and immigrants, outcasts and conquerors from every corner of the globe. A place of unending transformation, which has shaped the development of the nation and even the world again and again and again. To understand a place like this, you need more than just a tour guide. You need an historian. But how do you tell the history of a place with this much history? How do you tell a story about a place that has this many stories? That daunting task has been the life work of Mike Wallace. It has been a colossal project which spanned half a century, producing 3 gargantuan landmark books, which have in turn become the unrivaled guide to New York City's history. Mike's story began in Fresh Meadows at the eastern fringe of Queens, where he grew up in the 1940s, before spending much of his teenage years on Western Long Island. His parents were among the hordes of Americans pouring into the suburbs, but his upbringing gave him a personal sense of New York as a place of constant migration and transition, a grand theater for everyday human struggle and imperial fortune-making, the vision which became the leitmotif of his later work. His education led him to Columbia, where he studied under perhaps the dominant historian of the age, Richard Hofstadter. The mentorship was pivotal, not least because Mike joined the wider movement of young PhDs who, against the radical changes of the 1960s, demanded a more honest, inclusive accounting of U.S. history. This new generation of scholars wanted to do more than just debate the lives of a few great men. They wanted to write the history of the overwhelming majority of Americans, missing in most textbooks. Columbia's James P. Shenton helped catalyze this ambition when he enlisted a group of undergraduates to help Martin Luther King's civil rights group with voter registration and education in the South in 1965. Mike went to Georgia to engage in that work and later joined the anti-war group Students for a Democratic Society. He saw himself as a radical, committed to a different kind of history, giving voice to those who had been silenced.
The number of absences from the narrative were cumulatively enormous. Blacks weren't in the mix. Women were not part of the national narrative.
Mike collaborated with Hofstadter on an influential book, American Violence, which expressed this new critical approach. But the real turning point came with his time at the Radical History Review. As editor of the journal, Mike saw that his generation was doing nothing less than rewriting the entire sweep of U.S. history. Soon he began exploring the idea of a book that would synthesize this flood of new research, making it accessible to the public. It was a crazy idea, a huge project that only far more seasoned historians would normally consider. And Mike's plan was to do all of the U.S., not just New York City. He and his co-author, Edwin Burroughs, wrote several thousand pages before they gave up. Gotham was the result. It was the history of a city, not a country, but the argument was nearly the same. New York could stand for the whole because it was America's unofficial capital. It had moved from, quote, the center to the edge of the world, just as the United States had moved from, quote, colony to empire. And in that development, New York was far more pilot than passenger. Still, even with this smaller geographic scope, the first book took more than 20 years. It was meant to be a single volume covering all of New York City's history, but the first book alone clocked in at 1,383 pages. Volumes 2 and 3 were similar. But then it was a project of dizzying scope and synthesis. The bibliography ran to over 33,000 titles, at par with the largest bodies of research in history at large, such as World War II. Gotham traced New York's history from its establishment as a colony of the Dutch West India Company to consolidation of the 5 boroughs in 1898. It had everything: sex and sewer systems, finance and architecture, immigration and politics, poetry and crime. With a literary skill that made 1,000 pages fly by, Mike and Ted delivered a comprehensive picture of the city's history, which somehow never bored. It was the history of America, seen through its most influential city. Published in 1998, the book was an instant phenomenon. Critics hailed it as a revelation, a masterful fusion and interpretation which no less rarely made history sing. It won the most prestigious award in the field, the Pulitzer Prize for History. The following year, Mike also burst into the home of millions of Americans as the leading expert in Rick Burns' blockbuster documentary New York on the history of the city. For Mike, it was just the start. He consulted on a wide range of documentaries and exhibitions, and in 2001, he established the Gotham Center, the only academic institution devoted to New York City history. The goal was to network and support the vast number of professional and independent scholars working in this unaffiliated field, to make the city's history more visible, just a few years after New York's biggest historical institutions seemed like they might close, and to make that history valuable, a spur to public debate and imagination. Mike's personal life was as full of collaboration as his career. With Hope Cook, he crafted a series of walking tours that brought New York's history directly to its streets, making the past a physical, tangible experience for locals and visitors. With his wife, the acclaimed writer Carmen Belosa, he co-authored A Narco-History about how the US and Mexico jointly created the drug war. And his influence often extended beyond history and politics to fiction and cinema. He was an invaluable resource, for example, on Gangs of New York, making sure the Martin Scorsese film retained its gritty historical realism. In short, his work redefined what urban history could do. His books remain a standard that may not be repeated, illuminating the forces that created America's greatest city and which define us still. Please join us now and stand in celebration of this man, his legacy, and his message. That history is not a dead static thing, a dry book on a shelf, but a living force giving weight and momentum to our world today.
Ladies and gentlemen, the real star of the program, Mike Wallace. Vicky, Kim. Is this on? You here? Thank you all so much for joining tonight. We will actually be having a second video presentation later on before we conclude the program this evening. But now we are in the heart of tonight's event. Fate has robbed us of Mike's wisdom and great company in discussing this book, but I think we're extremely fortunate in having two really outstanding scholars to join us to unpack this staggering, weighty, awe-inspiring book. Kim Phillips-Fein requires no introduction for those of us who work in the field of 20th century American politics and political economy. She's a model researcher and true intellectual force whose historical and contemporary writing has explored the history of labor and capitalism, both institutions and ideas from the Great Depression to the present. Her first book, Invisible Hands, The Businessman's Crusade Against the New Deal, has been a staple on reading lists in college classrooms and graduate seminars since it was first published in 2009. Her more recent book, Fear City, New York's Fiscal Crisis and the Rise of Austerity Politics, brought another old story to a much higher level and has similarly become the new standard on the subject. And next year she'll be releasing her own kind of third volume in a trilogy, bringing the story into the present with a title I just can't get enough of. A Country of Lords, Neo-Aristocrats, Social Darwinists, Tech Utopians, and the Long Fight Against Equality in America. In all that work, for reasons I expect we might discuss tonight, she's maintained a steady focus on New York City, the headquarters of American capitalism, which led in part to her current title as the Robert Gardiner-Kenneth T. Jackson Professor of History at Columbia University. Vicky de Grazia joins us from Columbia as well, where she earned a PhD with distinction in 1976, just a few years after Mike, and with whom she also partnered on founding the Great Radical History Review. And withal has been a close friend and colleague for many years. Vicky began her career at City College here in CUNY, which has a rather large part in the story we're talking about tonight, as does Columbia, where she joined the faculty in 1994 and is now the Moore Collegiate Professor of History. Like Mike, whose family I should mention was also personally touched by World War II, his mother emigrating from Eastern Europe after the conflict. Vicky has a biographical anchor in this period too. Her father, a political scientist at NYU, became a decorated officer in psychological operations during the war. More importantly, however, she has made this period of history her life study, with a series of books that examine Western Europe and the rise of Italian fascism in particular, from a perspective of gender, and in her words, in development of a global perspective on commercial revolutions. Those publications include Irresistible Empire, America's Advance Through the 20th Century Europe, How Fascism Ruled Women, Italy, 1922 to 1945, and her current book project on intimacy and power under Mussolini. Kim, Vicky, thank you so much for joining. So we had a chat a few weeks ago, about tonight's event, and I think the very first thing I said was that it's sort of impossible, or at least pretty foolish, to try to take a book like this and summarize it, while we're also trying to place it within the larger scope of Mike's career, and of course, address the question of its relevance today. So obviously, that's what I'm going to ask you to do at the start. What is this brick about? Give us a sense of the scope, if you would. More seriously, what you see as the big moments or themes, and what you read in some of the choices that Mike made in beginning and ending this book, and either one of you.
Well, first of all, it's a gorgeous object, this book. Okay, a gorgeous, a gorgeous artifact of human labor, of course, Mike's in the first place, but also it's a beautifully published book. And Oxford's done an extraordinary job on it. So that, from the elegant cover design, the map of the city, circa 1945, that links it to the maps we saw on the covers of Gotham and Greater Gotham, the marbleized army green front and back boards, the fine felt spine holding the 958 pages smoothly in place, the glossy paper that gives off a delicious smell when you first crack the book open, and does justice to the myriad gorgeous color and high-resolution black and white illustrations, okay, and makes the inevitably small font eminently readable. Okay, let me just show you this is not the centerfold, but it's close to the center. Just so you can see the quality here, okay? But obviously, okay. Now, the question is, what is this book about? Now, the title seems clear enough. Gotham at War, 1933, 1945. Mike could have named it Gotham the Greatest, okay, or Gotham, capital of the world. But then, and you start to wonder, war in 1933? Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor is December 1941, and the US doesn't fully mobilize until the fall of 1942, and it won't open its famous second front in Europe, D-Day, until June 1944. And what does it mean for Gotham to be at war? Does it mean death and destruction? It is true that about 43,000 New Yorkers did die in the war, perhaps the highest per population in the United States. Okay? But no civilians to speak of, unlike Leningrad, goodness knows, or Coventry, or London in the Blitz, or the Italian towns that were bombed by the Allies. And there was none of the devastation that was common in some of the great capitals of the world, when things of Shanghai or Nanjing, Tokyo, Berlin, and so on and so forth. In short answer then, I think that Gotham at War is about the American way of war, using New York City as the case study. New York, the United States' most important city. Its total involvement, if at a great physical distance, transforming it in every aspect, from Greater Gotham, okay, 1898, when the boroughs come together, into what every observer practically, whatever their background, whether they were the Kremlin or in China, were described as the capital of the world. In short, it's a story about the rise of the United States to global power status, which begins to be undone only in the 1970s. We can come back to that, and rapidly is being undone more and more as we speak. And so it starts with 1933, January, the moment Hitler comes to power. Well, what relevance does that have? Well, Jews in New York City organized a boycott, okay, a declaration of war, understanding that Hitler was declaring war against the Jews, which would come to pass then in the course of the war itself after 1940, particularly with the invasion of the Soviet Union after 1941. And it ends, appropriately, with the foundation of the United Nations, totally unexpectedly, in a marvelous epilogue. Mike deals with it, which is supposed to be destined to create global governance, which would bring peace after the World War. Now, you want to know a little bit more about that than that. Well, I've discerned here 3 parts in this book. Okay? Omne trium perfectum, everything that comes in threes is perfect. And so the first 200 pages or so is about the war coming, okay? But it's also an internal war, a class conflict. It's refracted through the ethnic communities of New York. It's bound up with the wider world. In particular, it's bound up with the Jews and with the Italians, because they are so intimately involved with the forces of fascism. Okay? He deals there with the amazing coming stateliness of the Catholic Church, with a subtlety one might not expect from a Jewish boy from New York City. Remarkable, and particularly how it empowered in certain ways the Irish ethnic groups of the city to the eclipse and power of the Latin American communities. Okay? He deals there then with the great change that results in the way that diversity of the city was transformed. In Uno Plures, a section, he deals with the shift in what pluralism meant, because the capitalists and also scholars recognized that this furious disagreements over fascism created worries about the fissionability of the people of New York. And this brought, and you can see it in this marvelous piece on Franz Boas and his student Ruth Benedict. He goes from now the ethnic groups into the scholarly world, and with a very careful, very interesting analysis of the cultural transformations in ethnography and anthropology of the time to understand how this new ethnicity of New York was defined. Okay. He moves on. The richness of the mobilization of civil society in the popular front, the teaching of tolerance, figures that I wouldn't have known about, like Rachel Davis Du Bois, Columbia teacher cult, who is teaching about intercultural education. It talks about her work with the New Deal. He has a marvelous thing on the balladeers of brotherhood, the popular front multiculturalism, and the figure of Paul Robeson. I wish we had a QR here so that we could listen to some of the music. It would truly make this into a real Gesamtwerk. In sum, a pluribus unum, from many one, to uno plures, unity and diversity, and that was very much consistent with how Fiore LaGuardia wanted to organize politics, and probably we'll come back to that if we think of what's going on today. Okay. The second part, okay, intervening, mobilizing the impact of war, and there we get a global story, which is astonishing as the United States mobilize, as the conflicts create new opportunities for blacks, for women, and at the same time a closing down of those opportunities in the face of the capitalist structure of the city. Okay, let's see if I can. Here, you can see blacks stood out. I mean, the idea that this war was not a white man's, was a white man's war, putting up, rebelling, resisting the riots. But at the same time, the new contacts that were made by the black community with Gandhi to organize sort of peaceful press, to create a vast experience of civil rights when the post-war reaction tried to restore the old racist status quo. And the Jews, okay, 1,785,000 in New York City, not just the largest ethnographic religious group, 23.9% of the population, okay, the largest gathering in a city in the world, and the intense conflict amongst them about being loyal to their paradise in the United States and the Zionist project. Very acute. It would have been something that we wanted to extract and use on its own in the last year or so. Okay. And finally, the cultural boom. I'm just going very quickly. Nothing like war to animate culture. The peculiar Gotham profile, liberating, white and tan, race mixing. Also, the great infusion of European culture, which will allow cultural elites and capitalist elites in the United States to have a veneer to allow them to be superior to the Europeans, and in turn would encourage Europeans to appropriate the new American lifestyle coming out of the Marshall Plan. Finally, the third part, okay, that's 200 or so pages, 699 to 862, okay, looking to the post-war. And there, again, not a story, if you want, of progress, but the conflictuality of planning, which starts very early, 1944, already the idea by May for LaGuardia is the war is going to be over, we've won it, and so the planning that goes on, okay, enormous, brings in, all kinds of new thinking and all sorts of new conflict, okay, about whether it would be private, whether it would be state. And this, Mark argues in very broad terms, is the passage from the warfare state to the welfare state, or maybe a stronger connection between warfare state and welfare state, which is so central to the United States' identity leaving the war. So here I've given my mapping. You got to get through these things, and with extraordinary pleasure. We'll talk more about how I think it's set up as stylistically in terms of method in another moment. Thank you.
Well, if it's a challenge for the speaker to restrain and hold back on, it's worse for the moderator who wants to throw 1,000 questions and totally keep you all here for 10 hours. So I'll be responsible and toss the question to you, Kim.
Well, first of all, I would just like to say that it really is an honor to be here, and I think the book itself is a remarkable book. It inspires, I think it gives a feeling of humility reading it and engaging it. And I think that in a way, it's very moving to be here as well. I actually remember seeing Mike speak either here or maybe in one of the other auditoriums here, but about New Deal, New York. When was that? That was maybe 2003 or so?
Yeah.
And I remember coming to that event, and it's just remarkable to be here now, today. And in a way, I think while there's a certain sadness to us speaking instead of you being able to hear from Mike directly, there is also something that feels, I think, the book, the entire book and the entire Gotham project is a testament to the collective power of scholarship and the collective power of the city, and the way that through these things we become, that there isn't a tension between that individuality. I mean, this is very much a book that is Mike's book. It is a product of a single scholarly mind, and yet that is inseparable from the voices of the scholars whose work has gone into it, and then beyond that, the voices of the city itself that speak and shine through it. And so in a way, it feels, if there was any book for which this could be appropriate, it feels like this is it, that it is, that we are, in dialogue with it and with each other, and in a way, none of us can or does function alone, either as a scholar or in life more deeply. So I think that is one of the things I was thinking about getting ready. I will say second, the book is also moving to me personally. My family, or my father's family, emigrated to New York in the period described in this book. And my father was born in 1940 at Sydenham Hospital. My family were refugees from Germany, essentially. My grandfather was Jewish, my grandmother was not. They got married in 1932-33. They recognized quickly, or that my grandfather recognized that it was not safe to stay, and they left. They spent some time in Brussels, and then they came here. Much of my grandfather's, the rest of my grandfather's family did not leave so quickly, and they spent much of the rest of the 1930s grappling with what it meant to lose their citizenship, and much of the family reconciling themselves eventually and reluctantly to leaving their home and coming here. And they were part of a network, a kind of network described in the book of German Jews who were kind of bringing other people to the United States. And not all of them left, but many of them did. And so it was interesting that the book was also moving from that perspective. Vicky has given a wonderful description of the overall scope of the book. The book itself is remarkable, and in some ways my favorite of the series, although I love all three, and as a teacher of New York history, you use them constantly. But the compressed time period in some ways highlights the approach that is evident in all parts of the Gotham series. This vision of this ambition to show everything happening and the multitude of perspectives on everything all at once. And the book, it really shows and also the dynamic engagement between events in the city and the way that New York is constantly engaged, both with the rest of the country and with the rest of the world. It opens with the rise of Nazism and Hitler coming to power. It traces the opposition to war in the city and the eventual engagement in the war, and then the conclusion and the creation of the UN. And in many ways, the force of war, the danger of war, the threat of political violence, the awareness of what war does to cities in particular, suffuses the book. So there's a lot more to say about all of that, but I actually just wanted to read one quote. I'm actually not sure what page this quote is on, but I think it gives another sense of what the thrust of the book is overall. This is in this is a passage about the late 30s, and this is Mike, it's not a quote from someone else, but with anti-immigrant sentiment being stoked by global conflict and national depression, it is all the more remarkable that the 1930s witnesses the triumph of a very different reading of the city and the country, one that celebrated their multi-ethnicity as being the antithesis of, and indeed the antidote to, master race fascism. And I think that is one of there are a lot of arguments in the book, but one of the central ones is that New York is not, it is a vision of a particular kind of America and a particular kind of democracy. And the struggle over that is over that vision of America, of democracy, is part of what's happening over this period. And New York holds out a vision of a particular answer to those questions about what the United States means in the world and what the possibilities are. So I think that's one of the themes of the book, and we can talk about all of that more.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just throw in quickly that one of my favorite parts of the book is when very early on, Mike Riley quotes Joseph Goebbels, who says that it'll be so easy to basically sort of turn America into a fascist country because all of the diversity and tension between the races would make it so easy to play them like puppets on a string. And yet, of course, that's not what happens. And I think Mike makes a very compelling argument that New York really is, because of its history and its diversity and the antidote, as you said in that quote. I'll add to, just to tag on to what Kim said, that I read a version of this book many years ago, and part of the delay was that Mike was so fastidious about making sure to incorporate all that scholarship. You heard in the video that his bibliography runs to 33,000 titles, which is about as big a corpus of literature as you'll find in history. So, I mean, to give you a sense of the scale of this project.
And yet I have to say that despite this, somehow one of the things reading the book, I kept thinking, well, that would be a great topic for a student to work on. So in a way, it's both cumulative but also generative, and that I think also speaks to something about the city, that the sensibility that which I think all of the Gotham books kind of wake up this sensibility, that if you just kept going, if you could just keep looking, every corner, every story, every building, every person would be this key to unlock a bigger history. So,
well, let's segue to that, and the question about where we put this within the Gotham Project, or the series of books that Mike has produced and given to us, and the interpretive themes and things. Where do we place the roots of this? I don't know if this is a question that you want to address, Vicky, given your time with him. And
Yes, I'm here also because I first met Mike in 1972 at Columbia, and of course he was already a figure, having written this important book about violence in America with Hofstadter, which really shifted the terms. Finally you get, Brown, violence is as American as apple pie, but certainly Hofstadter, he thought a lot about paranoid style. He hadn't thought about, the nature of American violence. So it was already very active. And, this radical history review, well, that was, ultimately how it came out. But first it was this Marho Mid-Atlantic radical historians outfit or organization. And it started out with a leaflet and then extraordinary conferences, outside of the main structure of the university, something I think we're going to have to start going back to. Teachers College, big grim auditorium, and then John Jay, the City University, which was so very hospitable, bless it. And so, no money, of course. And this radical history review really did pose for the first time, what is radical history? And there were endless arguments and pushing and shoving and sneering, and it was pretty kind of vicious. And I do have to say, I won't say on the spectrum. Mike was here and I was there. I was a Gramscian and kind of looked through theory and concepts in Europe and so on. And Mike had a very different way. And in between, by the way, there were structuralists who believe in the annal totality, and there were what we called, and meanly, barefaced or barefoot empiricists. Some of them might still be here or might be here. In any case, Mike was an original here because of this ambition to get the whole and to get the mechanism. Maybe such an interest in not in power, but maybe power, but how power works. In society. One, that was, and second, how people act. This incredible interest in a kind of, dialectic, and, the vernaculars in which people express themselves, which he captures so beautifully and ever more beautifully in these books. I think that stylistically, I prefer this final volume, the first with Ted, with Edwin Burroughs, who's a very elegant writer, very old school, was indeed very elegant, maybe appropriate for the 19th century, sort of the long history of the New York City, the great city of New York. The second was Mike with his great verve, but this is a kind of mature voice, which doesn't use irony at all, which is wonderful. It uses a sense of wonder, okay, which you can't believe some of these stories, and yet that's, I won't say human nature, but that's what they're doing. That's what they're doing to each other. So not good and evil, this kind of moral or sentimental, but rather, if you want, both a methodology of research which will yield this extraordinary micro cases, and then this overarching narrative, which is not ever a narrative, I say, about progress or things getting better, but rather, in some ways, a dialectic, even though you could say it's a radical dialectic. It's not, if you want, a kind of conventional or traditional Marxist. So just to point this out, I think this very important 1960s, 70s especially, wonder about what should history be. But Mike really truly has been in many ways unique of having done that and having made very interesting choices in terms of his relations with the academy to achieve it by staying, I think, in the city university, a public institution. John Jay was very, very important, but an institution, if you want, of and by the city.
That's 50 years at John Jay College, for those of you who did not catch the reference. And I'll be responsible again and turn it over to you, Kim. How do you place this within the series?
I mean, I think Vicky mentioned the Annals School, and I think, I think it speaks to this, the Gotham Project as a whole. It's interesting to hear about its relationship to Radical History Review, but it does speak to, I guess I would say two things define it. First is this vision of a history that would contain all sides and all perspectives, and a sense of, I think you put it very well, the conflict, or kind of conflict as part of a place like New York, as part of the historical process, so that things are not just rising or falling, getting better or getting worse. There's a kind of constant state of conflict about what the future will become, what it will look like. And it's out of that conflict that we have history. And I think that's one element to it. I think another that I would point to is, and that's why it's important to try to capture all perspectives, or this vision that if you could capture all perspectives, you could see the whole thing. And it would be this kind of, it's not uniform. There are these different forces and different voices within it. Just thinking, I mean, this appears over and over again just in this book, but you mentioned the Catholic Church, the sections on the Catholic Church in the city, and in the sections on Catholicism, we see, both Dorothy Day and the kind of left-wing Catholicism, which is supportive of the Republic and the anti-clerical forces in the Spanish Civil War. We see the parts of the Catholic Church that were kind of sympathetic to fascism for different reasons. We see the Catholic Unionists, and also the kind of the people who were from Catholic background but less invested in the church, in the Transport Workers Union. So even in this, any single institution contains within it all of these different perspectives. I think that's one part of it. I guess the second that I would point to, and this is maybe more present actually in earlier parts of the Gotham trilogy, but a sense of but it's here too, the importance of material life and the materiality of things, that's always, there's a lot about culture and intellectual life, but they're always in this relationship to political economy, to where people work, what kinds of buildings they live in, what the infrastructure of the city is, so that there's this back and forth between the ideas and culture and music.
At
And
some level, there is this, like this material
Yeah.
culture. So sort of like if you, so sorry. The materiality. So if you know the sewer system, where the water comes from,
Right.
how the housing is built and planned, you begin to get a sense of how people live, and so the sort of man is what he eats. I mean, New York is, and so goes on its belly, and that's very very important. But it is never nothing static. It's always
Right.
centripetal forces and centrifugal forces, and that's again, which then is creative, very often in ways people couldn't possibly expect. I mean, there's parts on women, and you have Rosie the Riveter and emancipation brought by the war, but at the same time, this enormous movement of worry about the children,
Right.
which to deal, and then the relationship of working women, white, black, and black working people. So you begin to see that nobody is an island onto themselves, but rather this kind of constant jostling, which is very much, you want, the spirit of the city.
And historians will appreciate too how this kind of stands within where this project comes from, where Mike is entering as a graduate student at a time when studying under Richard Hofstadter, one of the avatars of what's known as consensus history, this notion that American history is defined by consensus. And here Mike is using New York City and digging down on all of these groups and putting them all in conversation, right? It's Gotham at war, meaning all of the city, right? Between and within its sort of constituent parts. And that is, it's not hard to read that as a response to not just consensus history, but these other kind of, that sort of liberal Whiggish view of history as progress, and any of these things that are sort of determinative. So it gets back to what you were saying earlier about the suggestiveness of the openness and contingency and possibility, right? So the way I read the way you were talking about the wonder, the aspect of wonder in this book is this emphasizing more the possibility that history always presents, for good and for bad. I will say though that then I'll shut up again and we'll move on to another question. But in listening to you, Kim, I was thinking about a quote that I just prepared. I just dug up in case it came up from Mike, just from an email exchange we had some years ago talking about this book, where he that I thought was rather memorable. And he said, in the course of, and I think this does apply to all the books, but particularly especially for this one. Mike says, in the course of writing a narrative history of New York City, it became clear that since colonial times, the macroeconomic order had repeatedly experienced a similar pattern, a deep structure forged following by an economic collapse that disrupted the existing economic and social arrangements, which were then rearranged by war again. Since the 17th century, this happened almost like clockwork. It was a mechanism that led to a prosperous remaking of the city, part one, and then in part two of the boom-bust war dynamic came collapse, which inaugurated a revolutionary revision of the social, political, and cultural order. It became clear that this oscillating rhythm was more than just a business cycle or a narrow economic phenomenon. The condition of the city, the relations between classes, races, genders, artists, architects, religious groups, immigrants, all of them were powerfully impacted by the shifting macroeconomy. And that is a worthy backdrop for scholars of the city to consider in writing their historical dramas. And there's a few things more powerful expression of that than the Great Depression and World War II.
In fact, it seemed to me in this book, it doesn't, kind of work that way. Otherwise, you could have the first half being about the Depression, and then boom, the story of the revival with the war. So it isn't that I don't think it's the same story. I was looking for that, which you could find in the other two volumes. It becomes much more complicated by the conflictuality that is related to the researchers, I should say, the rise of these warmongering fascisms, which sort of could create a whole new dynamic, which is not being ruled by capital in the conventional way.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that will maybe actually we'll find a way to get at that more with this last question, which is bringing it around to, and I'm sorry that we don't have more time to talk about it, because as all these comments suggest, this book is fantastically rich. It will be on sale after the event, and I hope that you will all consider picking it up and reading it and enjoying it for yourselves. But it's kind of, and we said this when we had our chat, it's kind of impossible to talk about this book or talk about this subject and not think about today. How do we think about this book today vis-a-vis what's going on in the news and where we find ourselves historically?
I thought, just to start, that in some ways this was the backdrop for the 1970s crisis. That is, one gets emerging this warfare welfare state, and that connected into Washington, connected to the Bretton Woods order. I mean, part really of the new global order which the United States rules, and where New York has sort of a big share in all of that. And that the 70s crisis struck me as the end, maybe, of that. That said, we often now a lot of talk about the real end is now. That in other words, these times are the real end of the post-war, which was formed.
Well, what's
all sorts of political and intellectual ramifications, goodness knows.
Right.
What's the Gramsci quote that everyone's been using?
Yeah, I think that I guess I would point to a couple of things about the book for the present. I think, so one thing that I think people will find very interesting in the book is this description, actually, or maybe I just find this interesting, my general historical interest, but the material in it about the actual presence of Nazism, or of Nazi sympathizers and of fascism in New York is quite interesting, and certainly just thinking about the present and the sources of a kind of fascistic ideas. This is actually, it offers a certain kind of grounding for that in a different moment and a different set of ideas and a different politics, but it offers a touchstone for thinking about some of those questions today. I also think the book more deeply just embodies the back and forth relationship between the vision that New York holds out for the rest of the country and the rest of the world. And I think the concluding chapters of the book are in some ways a surprise, I think. They are, so the book ends with the war ending, and it talks both about, but the last chapters are not just about the book ending, the war ending. They include the growing vision of, or just the different visions of the post-war world, and in particular, the kind of anti-colonial visions circulating in New York about the post-war world. And Mike talks about the Harlem Colonial Conference organized by W.B. Du Bois in 1945 at the 135th Street branch of the New York Public Library. This is attended by people who will then go on to become leaders in independence movements around the world. He talks about the Indian independence movement, and of course, India had been ambivalent about the war in certain ways because of being the anti-imperialist groups within India. He talks about the growing Puerto Rican independence movement, which also has currents in New York. So in a way, the book ends with invoking these anti-colonial movements around the world. And then the last moves of it, Mike describes the moment of silence at 4 p.m. On the day of Roosevelt's funeral in Washington, D.C. I actually had never heard this story before, but there was LaGuardia decided to call everything to a halt at 4 p.m. in keeping with the funeral happening in D.C., and the newspapers went quiet, and the phones went off for a brief moment. And then it goes on, though. It doesn't stop there. He goes on to describe the incendiary bombing campaign in Tokyo over the spring, and then the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which are invoked with just single kind of very, very brief paragraphs of a sentence or so. And then the parallel at the end of the war when Japan surrenders, the million people gathering in Times Square, and the vivid life of this city juxtaposed to the destruction of the others, and the slow dawning of the horror that what happened there could happen here, what the atomic bomb could mean for New York. And the fascination with this, or the kind of invocation of it, in the months and years that followed the atomic bombs, and the idea that that this then produces, in a way, the United Nations, and the vision, however difficult it may be to remember or look back to, of a world that has turned against war altogether, and that is the necessary precondition for any city, in a way, in an atomic age. But in a way, the very, very final note of the book is kind of just it ends with the UN coming to New York, but the very last paragraphs of the book are about the UN, this vision, this possibility, this utopian promise, but it is also a land deal, and so it ends with the description of the Zeckendorfs selling the property, trying to figure out how to offload this property that they had picked up, which had been, and they say, I know where we can put the UN, where the slaughterhouses were, because it had been this site of slaughterhouses, and then they sell it and are managed to make off with $8.5 million, and that's where it ends. And in a way, I think it's really a perfect ending. It's kind of just the sublime and the actual world of profit, interest, individuals, kind of making their way all kind of at once. Those things aren't separable. They are what the world is and what history is. And so I think that is it's a brilliant end. The whole set of last chapters. I think I just want the one other part of the book, and this I think has been mentioned in some reviews, so people may have heard about it. But I think another really phenomenal part of the book are the chapters about the growing awareness of the Holocaust, and because people didn't know really the kind of how did people come to learn of what was happening, and the reluctance of the Times to focus excessively on the suffering of the Jews. And
New York Times.
Yeah, the New York Times. Sulzberger's ambivalence about this, not wanting to make it seem like too much was being said about one group, and anxiety about, and that's another theme running through the whole book. But then the ways in which people come to learn. So I think that's also, and the kind of combination of, the sense, I mean, it's that those chapters are very powerful, so.
Yeah, we're not going to be able to do justice to the full scope and verve of this book, but I would just add that the sections on the pulling together of that coalition and the switch between the folks on Wall Street who go from being sort of financiers to Hitler's regime to joining the fighting liberals, as Mike puts it, becoming the Wall Street warriors of World War II and kind of simultaneously the Cold War that follows. the fate of the Popular Front, which is another focus of one of the reviews that our friends at Commentary Magazine dwelled on, and so much more. The birth of anti-fascism, the birth of anti-racism, Mike placing all of these as central New York City stories that maybe cannot be actually extracted from their origin here, and the dynamics and characteristics of the city.
Of course, what can't, especially in the chapters about this changing notions of pluralism as the ethnic groups, all these ethnic communities, forces begin to renegotiate their status in the face of the coming war, and how Fiorello LaGuardia, manages that. I mean, sometimes it's his cup of tea. There's a book that will be coming out called The Habsburg Mayor of New York, because he had this extraordinary European background with many, many languages, part Jewish, going through Hungary and so on and so forth. And certainly it does make one think about how Mamdani is managing the huge changes in the ethnic political cultures of New York City, and how that peculiarity in some ways, peculiarity of this New York politics, which is somewhat like in the late 1930s and 40s with LaGuardia sort of standing out, and then other figures as well, goodness knows.
Yeah, no, I think that the just thinking about the present, and it does also, the ways the city has changed from this World War II era city, but with the rise of new immigrant populations, in particular after the 1965, but it's new groups of people, but still an immigrant city, and yes, I think, Mamdani speaking to that.
Yeah, it retains that sort of pregnant multiplicity and possibility and ambiguity from different ends. So we will, in a minute, be watching that second video that I teased earlier tonight, but we're actually going to pause here so that I can welcome to the stage Robert Snyder, the official historian of Manhattan, who has come to us with a surprise announcement that just came in.
Mike, this comes from the office of the mayor in City Hall. As a former colonial port city that evolved into a modern global metropolis, New York boasts an extraordinary history, and we are grateful to all those who work to preserve our rich heritage. The internationally acclaimed author, educator, and scholar Mike Wallace shines brightly among them, and today I am pleased to recognize his tremendous contributions to the 5 boroughs. Whereas, for more than 50 years, Mike has worked tirelessly to inform and captivate people of all backgrounds through his books, lectures, and curated museum exhibits, and more. Tonight, the CUNY Graduate Center is hosting an event to celebrate the publication of Gotham at War, A History of New York City from 1933 to 1945, his third and final volume in this series. I am delighted to join everyone gathered in congratulating Mike on this monumental achievement and in applauding his brilliant career of documenting our beloved city's civic, economic, and cultural life, and the fascinating stories of our diverse residents. Together, we look forward to the many ways Mike's accomplishments and his collective works will continue to engage and inspire audiences in the Big Apple and beyond for generations to come. Now, therefore, I, Eric Adams, Mayor of the City of New York, do hereby proclaim Wednesday, October 8th, 2025, in the city of New York as Mike Wallace Day.
The mayor is not the only one who wanted to congratulate Mike on his accomplishment, and so we're going to end with this video that we gathered from some of the major leading historians of New York City who wanted to share their own congratulations. And then we'll have book signings by Mike Wallace outside. So.
There's very few books that embody Oxford University Press's history division more than the Gotham series. They're kind of essential to it. They almost define it in the same way that the books define the city that are the subject. So I've worked with Mike for about 20 years now. Worked with Mike, meaning mostly admired, appreciated, sometimes had to nudge slightly, but mostly just guided in a very gentle way these books into their completion. And this last one is no exception. It is an extraordinary work. From the very beginning, Mike said that what I write are mosaic murals, which means you can look at them as a giant picture, a sort of sweeping, big-hearted statement of New York. And you can look at the mosaics themselves. These are very fine-tuned, brilliantly illustrated, brilliantly particular moments and people and events. And his books combine them, and that's what Gotham at War does as well. So I'm delighted finally that it's coming out. Mike has been a pleasure to work with for 20 years. And I have high hopes for this book. All of us at Oxford do. I haven't seen a book that has galvanized a publishing house quite the way this one has. So we have high expectations and high hopes, and also just warmest feelings about Mike and the future of this particular book and all of the books in the Gotham series. So
I just wanted to say thank you so much for your body of work. It's been an inspiration and a joy to work from and teach with. I use it in every class that I teach about the city. I can't wait for the new book, and I'm planning to assign it in the fall once it is out. And I think that your books, they are unusual books in the way that they capture the breadth of the city as a whole, and the way that they capture the uncontrollability and dynamism and infinite worlds that this one city contains. And I think your books make me think, I may or may not believe in God, but I know that I believe in New York. And your books give an illustration of the worlds within the city, the way they go on and on and on. So thank you so much for them and for the lifetime of work that you've spent exploring this mischievous and marvelous monument that is our Gotham, our New York.
I first met Mike Wallace, I think it was around 1977. I was the first employee of the MARHO, the Radical Historians Organization, and the organization that created the Radical History Review, and that's where I met Mike and Ted Burroughs. And at that time, they were talking about Gotham, or rather, the big book that they were going to work on, which of course was not published for at least another 20 years and a bit more. Yet at the same time, Mike really played an important role, both as being a mainstay of the Radical History Review, along with Ted and a smaller group of editorial collectives, members of which I belong to. He's very memorable because he was already a brilliant lecturer in the cases where I got a chance to hear him lecture, and let's say remarkable among historians of that period of time for having style. And that was impressive in a very drab, even though it was the backwash of the 1960s. What I'm really struck about Mike is, aside from the landmark aspect of Gotham, the first volume of which he worked with, of course, with Ted Burroughs, and both its scholarship and its vision and its voice, but also as a person who was devoted to a community of historians. And I think the Gotham Center, which of course he created, and particularly with Suzanne Wasserman and now with Peter Christian Aigner, has been a significant institution that both encompasses scholarship and scholars and the wide range of people who make New York City history.
I've written a lot about New York City. It's a subject that I consider one of mine and that fascinates me. So I have gotten so much from Mike Wallace's 3-volume Gotham history, which I think is a monumental work of scholarship and literary merit. It's especially the last volume, Gotham at War, which is my favorite and which is just coming out. What makes this so unique is that Mike Wallace has zeroed in on every aspect of life in the city, the major players, the ordinary people, the technology, the environment, and isolated each of these strands into individual chapters. So each chapter plays like a short story because Mike Wallace is a very good storyteller, and you're not distracted by other things. You're just getting deeper and deeper into each subject. So for instance, he has a whole passage about the German U-boats that were hunkered down in the port of New York and basically picking off all of these American boats. I never knew anything about this. It was shocking to me that it went on for so long. There's a lot like that. It's one of the things that makes the book so entertaining is that Mike Wallace has a real sense of irony and a real sense of humor.
I met Mike Wallace 49 years ago when I came to New York in 1976. And one of the first things I did was volunteer to join MARHO, the Radical Historians Organization, which Mike was utterly instrumental in both creating and sustaining. In fact, the MARHO office was Mike's office at John Jay College. And that's where I met Mike. And one of the things I learned first from Mike, besides the fact that he was quite a brilliant historian, was the fact that he was deeply committed to public history. What he wanted more than anything else was to convey historical knowledge and understanding to as broad an audience as possible. So ironically, rather than getting involved directly in the publication of the Radical History Review, which was an ongoing project, a journal that, by the way, is still going 50 plus years later, I worked with Mike on the public history aspects of radical history, which included forums and conferences that we organized at John Jay College. And one of the things I learned from Mike and from that work on Radical History Review was how essential it was for history to be broadly and openly accessible to a broad public.
Mike, my name is Nico Fund. I was, up until about 3 weeks ago, your publisher at Oxford University Press. And one of the aspects of my departure that pained me was realizing that if I were to move to Yale, as I did, I would miss the publication of Gotham at War. So I'm thrilled to have been invited to this celebration, and more generally, I wanted to say that I am honored to have been associated for the entirety of my time at Oxford with your project. One of the annual rituals for me is that I go up to the Columbia Publishing course and I talk to the students there, and one of the examples of a book, a meaningful book, a high impact book, a book that matters, that I always make reference to is Gotham. And so for me to have during that entire 25 years, always, Gotham was always moving back and forth between being in the background to the foreground. It was a book, I'm not sure if you remember, that we did a massive promotion on for the Kindle and sold 16,000 copies of it in one day, which was one of the more extraordinary moments of my publishing life. And so I'm really looking forward, even if I'm no longer officially associated with OUP, to seeing the book out and to buying copies and telling everybody about it. So congratulations, and thank you so much for allowing me the privilege to be associated with your work. And I say that not just as a publisher, but as a New Yorker.
He has inspired so many people to care about this city, and warts and all. I mean, I think warts and all is right to say it, but he does it in such a introspective and thoughtful way that even though I don't always agree with everything Mike's saying, I'm always stunned and amazed at what he's writing about and how well he's doing it. So I think he's done a lot. I've known Gotham's not the only thing he's ever written, but Gotham is the towering monument to his legacy, I think. And I think it will be there as a monument to Mike Wallace and also to Ted Burroughs centuries from now, because it's just too hard to do, to know as much as he does, and then to somehow be able to synthesize it and interpret it. And I think that Mike he deserves all of our thanks and gratitude for not only studying New York history, but conveying its richness and its dynamic character.
I've known Mike since the early 30s, I think. I'd have to really count this up. But we were undergraduate history majors together. We were graduate students together. We were both students of Richard Hofstadter and pretty close to him, I would say. Certainly, Mike was Hofstadter's main research assistant, but many of the ideas in his great books about Gotham, Mike's great books about Gotham, came from his discussion of history with Richard Hofstadter. Like Hofstadter, and Mike was a scintillating writer. He was a great storyteller. He a very diligent researcher, his books obviously received great acclaim, Pulitzer Prize, etc. But I also remember Mike as part of the world of Columbia University in the 1960s. Nowadays, Columbia is a pretty lively place, as everybody knows. But going back to the earlier 60s, Mike and I were both members of student radical organizations, SDS and groups like that. It's interesting to think back on how that influenced Hofstadter's own work. Remember, Hofstadter's last book was about the history of violence in America. Mike did most of the research for that book. I know that quite well. And I think he changed the way Hofstadter thought about American history.
While I was working on my book, Language City, The Fight to Preserve Endangered Mother Tongues in New York, I was a Gardner Fellow at the Gotham Center, and Mike's feedback and advice as one of the earliest readers of the manuscript was crucial. He was already an intellectual hero of mine. I'm not a historian, but his work, Gotham, Greater Gotham, now the latest, have just shaped my view of the city I've called home since I was born, have been fundamental to me. And his advice and his guidance on my book meant the world to me. Mike is the essential New York City historian. He's the essential New Yorker, and I just wish him well with everything, and his work means the world to me.
When Gotham first came out in 1998, I was teaching at Collegiate, and the kids there have a little bit of money. So I took a chance and I ordered the book as a classroom text. Okay? And we went through it. And they loved it and I loved it. This was, they were reading this big, hardbound book. But we all were loving the depth of research, the awareness of all the major trends in American historiography, and the fluid language that he and Ed Burroughs put together.
Sometimes works of synthesis, scholarly synthesis, are transformational in the sense of really connecting all the dots in a compelling, sweeping narrative in a way no one has done before. And that's clearly what Mike's been doing in his work life for the past several decades, to the advantage and enrichment of us all in our field. And I have no doubt that his new book, Gotham at War, will do the same, will continue the
That concludes our program tonight, but as I said, Mike Wallace will be signing copies of the new book, which is for sale outside, so we hope you'll join us. Thank you again for joining us this evening. For everyone watching at home, to WNYC for recording tonight, and hope to see you all again.